I was wondering who died, but I'm not dead yet, so just so you know. Yeah, I'm a little funereal there. But first of all, I just wanted to thank all of you for coming. I certainly appreciate the attendance, and hopefully you've enjoyed yourself at the class. Today we will be talking about Burma, India, China, and these giant land battles that took place in Asia that are not really part of what we normally think about as going on during World War II in the Pacific. And also I want to talk about how Asian nationalism rose during this time with the Japanese and their role in that deal. So why did this change Asian nationalism so much? So if we remember back, the reason the Japanese went into the war was they intended to do something which they said was seize the golden opportunity. And the golden opportunity was presented to them by Germany. Their assumption was that Germany would defeat Britain, would defeat Russia, and consequently they would be able to get the U.S. to be so involved with what was going on in Europe that the U.S. would acquiesce to their achieving hegemony in Asia. And that was their whole idea. They certainly thought that they would be able to take over Asia, or not take it over necessarily, but they would be the father of Asian nations. They never looked at it like Germany with Lebensraum in the east, where they were going to actually conquer Russia. They looked at it as that, in a Confucian manner, that indeed they would be the father nation of Asians. And they intended, of course, to exploit the Asian resources until, in their opinion, until the war was over, and then they would have a more benign sort of a relationship with those countries. That was what they said. I'm not necessarily sure that would have worked out that way, but that's what they were thinking. Well, what happens is, if you look at the war in Europe, and I'm not going to go into this in any great detail, but certainly by 1943, say January of 43, when the Germans have lost at Stalingrad, it's pretty much obvious that the war is not going particularly well for the Germans. And if you based your whole strategy on the war in the Pacific, on what was going to go on in Europe, you're looking at a problem. So the Japanese made a decision at that point to make a major change in what they were going to do. And what they were going to do is they were starting to enlist other Asian nations in order to help them achieve something. First of all, if nations are friendly to you, they're more likely to give you a benefit of their natural resources. They are also going to do, basically use the Asian people now as a weapon against the Allies. So what they do is they have this big conference, and also what they do is they begin to give these countries independence. So, for example, Burma is made an independent country. The Philippines is made an independent country. Now, we were going to give the Philippines independence anyway in 1947, I believe, but they preempt this. They give independence to India. Now, they don't control India, but the fact of the matter is they say they create a provisional government of India, and they give them these two little islands. And these two little islands, in effect, become their version of free India. And we'll talk much more about this. Well, if you read one of the books I recommended, which is called The Rising Sun by John Toland, I think this quote is very interesting. And what he said was, "The West failed to see the significance of these events. The new governments were puppets of Japan, but through them, millions of Asians glimpsed freedom from the white man for the first time." So the Japanese, and you may remember early on that they had used indigenous populations to help take over, for example, Malaya and Burma. So they would get involved with these organizations that wanted independence from colonial rule, and they would indeed use them as scouts or to give them, directions and, help with, be like a fifth column, I guess would be the best way to put it. So they have this giant conference, and it's really looked at here as a propaganda move primarily. And yes, indeed, it was a propaganda move. But the fact of the matter is, to use Toland again, the people of Asia didn't necessarily all think that this was just propaganda. They did not necessarily particularly the Dutch. They didn't particularly like the British rule in India and Burma. They didn't really necessarily like our rule in the Philippines. But as we saw, we were actually a little bit more benign, and the Philippine people actually aided us significantly in defense against Japan, and I would say much more so than the British and Dutch subjects. So they have this conference, and the chairman, of course, is Premier Tojo of Japan, and you can see him in the middle here. There's Mr. Tojo. They have the Prime Minister of Manchukuo. Now, you may remember what Manchukuo was when the Japanese took over Manchuria from China in 1931 and 32. They created a government there that would, of course, be friendly to Japan. And they renamed it, instead of Manchuria, they named it Manchukuo. They sent their prime minister, and I think I may have mentioned that the head of state for this country is, in fact, the last emperor of China. I believe his name was Puni. So that's another country that's here. They send in a gentleman from China. Now remember, they have vast areas of China that they control. They have set up a puppet, or maybe you want to use the term Quisling government in China as well. So this gentleman is there. Ba Ma, head of the state of Burma, he was one of the people that actually was much involved in helping the Japanese to capture Burma. He is now head of state and actually head of government there as well. A gentleman we'll talk about much more in detail, Subhas Chandra Bose. He is head of what they really should refer to as Azad Hind, which means Free India. And we'll get much more about him today. And Jose P. Laurel, he is the president of the Second Philippine Republic, and he's also, we'll discuss him in detail. So he is there. And lastly, they have an envoy from Thailand. Now, or you might call it at this time Siam. So the envoy there is actually part of the royal family. And the reason they send him is the premier, the head of government for Thailand, doesn't want to go to this thing because he thinks that they've already been set free, so they don't want to associate too much. And the other thing is that he actually is afraid to leave the country because he's afraid he'll be deposed. So consequently, he's decided, well, I think I better stay home. So, as these people get more and more involved with this, they become more and more compassionate about and more fired up about a thing called Pan-Asianism. And we could simply make Pan-Asianism Asia for the Asians. And the Japanese have always used Pan-Asianism throughout the war as their justification for the war. So in other words, they've always put out the proposition that the war is set to free Asia from Western influence, and any war that is sanctioned by the emperor is a just war. So if the emperor says this war is okay because he is a divine person, indeed this war is justified, and it allows for something the Japanese refer to as compassionate killing. Now we're thinking, well, what would compassionate killing be? So anyone that objects to Pan-Asianism and therefore the emperor's will obviously is not a good person, is obviously siding with the West, and therefore their death is a benefit to Asians in general. So consequently, the term compassionate killing. Now, Ba Ma, I use this one quote, and I think this is a pretty tremendous statement by him, and I just try to pick this one, but there's many, many speeches in this. And he says, in the past, which now seems to be long ago, it was inconceivable that the Asian people should meet together as we are meeting here today. Well, the impossible has happened. It has happened in a way which outstrips the boldest fantasy or dreams of the boldest dreamer among us. From every point of view, East Asia is a world in itself. We Asiatics forgot this fact for long centuries and paid heavily for it. For as a result, Asiatics lost Asia. Now that we have once more, thanks to Japan, recaptured this truth and acted upon it, the Asiatics shall certainly recover Asia. So you can see that they are really, really, really into what's going on here. Bama also, when they received independence from Japan, immediately declares war on Britain and the United States. And he's not very shy about this to his people. He tells them straight out that indeed we are now on the front lines of the struggle. So he knows that he's put himself in jeopardy and his country. Jose Laurel, another interesting character, I think very interesting, because we were going to grant them independence. When he gets in charge, he's really been left behind. He's been tasked with the thoughts that he will be a go-between between the Japanese new occupation and the previous government. But the Japanese also want to grant that independence because they're desperately trying to get the Philippines under control. Keep in mind, and I mentioned this already, the Japanese were not particularly welcomed by the Philippine people. And there's a significant amount of guerrilla activity in Japan, much more so than any other Asian nation that I can think of. So consequently, I think we had generated some goodwill towards the Philippine people by the fact that we had already said that we would make them an independent country. So Japan is desperate to stop using troops and stuff and to get more resources out of the Philippines without constantly fighting all these guerrilla battles. Well, like I said, Laurel is left behind. So when the original government leaves with MacArthur from Corregidor, the gentleman's name, the president, was Quezon. Quezon leaves and creates a government in the United States, much like, for example, the Dutch did in Britain when Holland was captured. But he leaves this guy behind. And the reason he chooses him is Laurel is very, very close to the Japanese. His son attended the Japanese equivalent of West Point. So he's got a significant amount of knowledge and whatever, thought process of being close to Japan. So they think that he'd be a good person to try to collaborate, in a sense, with the Japanese. So basically they won't be so hard on the Philippine people. Well, even Laurel, who is a questionable figure, I can see why he would want to be, he's a nationalist. He wants his independence he wants the Philippines to be an independent country. And I get that. But even he starts getting very swept up in this conference. And he states 1 billion Orientals, 1 billion people of Greater East Asia. How could they have been dominated, a great portion of them particularly by England and America? So you can see that he is getting wrapped up in Pan-Asianism as well. Well, now we have a very questionable character. And some of you may remember this gentleman as he ran Indonesia into the, I believe, early 60s when the Suharto government took over. And this gentleman is Sukarno. And he was actively involved in trying to get Indonesia separated from the Dutch for many, many years. But the Japanese, notice, they don't invite him to this conference. And the reason they don't invite him is Indonesia is just a little too valuable to be given away right at the moment. So they don't really want control with an indigenous Indonesian government. And according to Sato, who's actually very close to Tojo at the time, Tojo says, Indonesia is not quite ready for all that treasure. They shouldn't be handling that. So you can see that, even though the Japanese claim was that they were just going to be the father of independent nations, even then they were certainly not in any position where they wanted to give up control of this stuff at that time. Well, Sukarno makes a decision that he will basically do anything to get control of the Indonesia away from the Dutch. And he's going to basically sacrifice the lives of many, many, many Indonesians in order to achieve that goal. And the reason that is a thing called Romusha. Now, Romusha is a forced labor group that the Japanese put together, and they literally take, I would say easily, 1 million Indonesians and put them to work all over East Asia. Not just in Indonesia, but they ship them to Burma, they ship them to all over the region where they need labor and construction people. And they, in effect, are slave labor, really. That's what they are. So they're not fed properly. Many of them die working on, for example, the Burma Railroad. And he recruits for the Japanese. He literally tries to get as many of his people as he can to work for the Japanese, thinking that eventually he will be able to throw off the Dutch. So you can see that they really didn't like the Dutch very much. And they also begin to adopt strict agrarian policies. They stop the Indonesians from growing food and start making them grow castor oil plants. And the idea of the castor oil plants is indeed what they're going to do is they're going to use that for lubricants and perhaps to refine it further to make more aviation fuel. But they're also taking Indonesians' food, because the Japanese army that's stationed in Indonesia cannot get food from Japan. So they begin, first of all, stopping them from growing food crops, and second of all, the Japanese army is eating. What does that cause? Well, that caused a widespread famine. And the estimates are that 1 million Indonesians starved between 44 and 45. But Sukarno continues to back this just for the fact that he thinks he's going to get Indonesian independence. And of course, the Allies view him as a major collaborator. Now, what is most interesting to me in this regard is this gentleman goes on to be the leader of Indonesia into the 60s. So the Indonesian people must have been willing to put up an awful lot in order to get rid of the Dutch. Because I can't imagine that if he was collaborating at this level, that they certainly had to know about it. And indeed, they were willing themselves, in some regard, to put up with this behavior, and he becomes president of Indonesia. All right, so what goes on at this conference? First of all, they establish that they're all for world peace, and everything's happy, and everybody's going to enjoy prosperity, and yada, yada, yada. But they also mentioned this one, and I thought this was interesting. I won't read it all, but the United States of America and British Empire are seeking their own prosperity, oppressed other nations and peoples, especially in East Asia. They indulge in insatiable aggression, exploitation, to satisfy their inordinate ambition. So basically, the entire war is the fault of Britain and the United States. They're going to, again, they're going to have cooperation, everybody's going to be happy. We're going to have a fraternity of nations, respecting one another's sovereignty. They're going to respect traditions and creative faculties of race and enhance culture and civilization of Greater East Asia. They're going to have economic and forget about it, and promote thereby general prosperity. And I think this is the most interesting one of all of these goals of this conference, is this: the abolition of racial discrimination. So indeed, Asians feel that they have been discriminated, and they have for hundreds of years, by the imperialist West. Well, what's the U.S. and Great Britain and China doing about this? Well, we have a conference pretty much a couple of weeks after theirs. And our conference is a little different. Not necessarily particularly better, but certainly different. And you can see that they meet in Cairo. And they can't have Stalin there because Stalin is technically at peace with Japan. In fact, the Russians, as you may know, don't get into the war until basically the last 2 weeks of the war, and of course they go in on the side of the Allies. But right now, Stalin cannot attend this conference. Well, Roosevelt has a vision of the world. And the vision of the world for Roosevelt is there's going to be 4 great policemen: the US, Russia, Britain, and indeed China. He goes so far as to tell Chiang Kai-shek that, you know what, at the end of the war, we're not going to let the French back into Indochina. We are going to make Indochina a protectorate area of China itself. And actually, Chiang Kai-shek refuses to do that. He goes, I don't know, that's kind of a questionable move. But Roosevelt actually proposes that the French be removed from Indochina and be given. So if you go down the road a ways, obviously that would make a huge change in the Vietnam War. Well, Churchill doesn't really think too much of this, but he doesn't have a lot to say. And the U.S., under Roosevelt, actually gives up all our territorial rights to China before this conference takes place. So if you think about it, of course, I'm not so sure, and I never could really nail this down, if the British agreed that Hong Kong would be gone as well. I think they were intending to keep it until its lease ran out. But all other agreements between those two countries as far as territory goes were renounced previous to this conference. And I think this is a really interesting quote. This is from Lord Moran, who is a close friend of Churchill. And he says, speaking about Roosevelt, to the president, China means 400 million people who are going to count in the world of tomorrow. But Winston thinks only of the color of their skin. It is when he talks of India or China that you remember he is a Victorian. So again, the British were not really very fired up about this whole thing. I'm sure the French probably wouldn't have been either. Well, the agreement basically does this. Everything that Japan has had accomplished from 1895 until the Treaty of Versailles, which is obviously in 1919, all that territory is going to be returned to China and other countries, particularly China. So the areas of China that were taken in 1895, they go back. Manchuria goes back. The Pescadores, Formosa, all that territory is now going to be back and returned to China. And, I like this line, in due course, Korea shall become free and independent. Not right away, but we'll eventually give Korea back too. So Roosevelt sees Chiang Kai-shek as the leader of Asia. Very similar to the fact that at the other conference they saw Tojo as the leader of Asia. So there's two competing thoughts here. Unfortunately for Chiang Kai-shek, because he is willing to deal with the Western imperialists, many Asians do not think that he is an Asian. So in effect, he would be viewed not just by Japan, but by many other Asians as someone that would deserve compassionate killing. So the Japanese are in a quandary. Now that they've come up with these thought processes, they have to start to begin to use these. So they're going to start out in Burma, and there's going to be two offensives there. One is Ha-Go and one is U-Go. Always remember, Go means operation. So they're going to start February and June of 44, and we're going to be under control of this guy. His name is Mutaguchi. He's a really interesting, weird character, I guess would be the best way to put it for him. So you remember back in late 42, basically the Japanese army had booted Britain out and the Indian armies completely out of Burma. And at the time, there were many Japanese officers that thought this would be a good opportunity to take more territory in Burma and in fact invade into India. Mutaguchi says, no, we can't do that because the terrain is so bad, we're running out of logistics, we're not going to be able to do this. Because it's just that there's no roads, there's no way to move things properly, and we're running beyond our capabilities. That's what he originally thinks. Then what happens? Well, this guy, and this is kind of a typical English thing, I think. His name is Ord Wingate. And Ord Wingate is this unusual character. That's the best way I can put him. I'm not going to go into detail about him, but he's only the British, I think, would have someone like Ord Wingate. He's kind of like Lawrence of Arabia, in effect, for World War II. But he's an innovative guy. And what he decides to do is that he's going to make raids into Burma using aircraft to support him. So basically, they'll get an area that's got some space where they can drop parachute supplies in, and he's going to radio in, we're at XYZ position, and planes will come in and drop them supplies. So they're going to move through Burma without roads and in terrible terrain, without a supply line, in fact, using aircraft as a supply line. Well, what happens is this Mutaguchi is enraged by this because he feels that he's been shamed because he didn't go into India when he had the opportunity. If the British could do this, well, certainly the Japanese can. So consequently, he's mad. And another thing about him is he was at the Marco Polo Bridge incident, which starts the war with China, and he firmly believes that he is destined to win the decisive battle for Japan. Now, a lot of the other people in the Japanese army think, well, maybe he's a little funny in the head. But he's totally convinced of this. Well, he decides to make this attack. And what they're going to do is they're going to launch a diversionary attack in southern Arakan, and I'll show you a map shortly, and that will be the Hago part of this plan. And the idea of that is to draw British forces away from a place called Imphal and Kohima and draw those forces south, so then he can launch the main attack and go into India proper. Also, what they're hoping to do is stop something called the Lido Road. The U.S. is trying to support China by flying supplies over the Himalayan mountains. That's what they've been doing for years. Well, the U.S. has also decided that they're going to build a road from India into China because no road exists. The British are not particularly thrilled with this either because, quite honestly, the British don't want a road from India to China because they're afraid at some point the Chinese may indeed invade India. But again, they don't really have much to say about it. It's a U.S. deal, and the U.S. is pushing this forward. And of course, the Indians think it's a good idea too. So, how are they going to achieve this? And Mutaguchi is found part of the answer. And part of the answer is this gentleman, Subhas Chandra Bose. He is the leader of the Provisional Government of Free India. Remember, the Provisional Government of Free India only has 2 little islands. But indeed, this is an interesting character as well. He is very, very friendly with Japan and Germany. And he was originally the president of the organization under British rule in India. Well, the British find out in '39 that he's just a little too cozy with the Germans, and he's talking about separating India from British rule, and they decide they're going to arrest him. He escapes, and because it's '39, he manages to escape through the Soviet Union and get into Germany. And the German government treats him rather well. They look at him as an asset. So while he's in Germany, he begins to make radio broadcasts. So this is, if you think about this, this is kind of like if the President of the United States was overthrown and escaped to another country and started making radio broadcasts, because he's famous. He's not like, some little strange little party. He was a big shot. He was in charge of their, the Indian part of their government. So there's also a thing called the Indian Legion he creates. 3,000 Indians are captured in the western desert fighting against the Germans. He convinces these people to join the German side, to defect and become part of this organization that wants to free India. So he also becomes more and more pro-fascist, and he becomes more and more right-wing as he makes these broadcasts, and he decides that democracy is dead, and the only government of the future is indeed going to be fascism. Well, by 43, he decides that he wants to go back to Asia. There's not much he can do in Germany because there's only 3,000 people. But he sees an opportunity in the Burma area to recruit more Indians and to indeed free India from British rule. And they transport this guy by submarine all the way from Germany back to Singapore. And he raises this new Indian National Army, the INA. And what he does is he gets expatriate Indians. Remember, there was a large organization of expatriate Indians that indeed wanted freedom from Britain. And many Indian soldiers were captured by the Japanese at the fall of Singapore. So he recruits these people to become this new army. Now, they're not particularly well armed. In fact, what they do is they arm them with weapons that were left by the British at the fall of Singapore. So basically, they're using the British Enfield rifle rather than the Japanese Arisaka. And they don't have any heavy artillery or a lot of things like that, but they have a lot of infantry weapons. Well, when he's in Singapore, he meets Tojo. He's recruiting people, and there's Tojo, and they're at a conference. And he starts telling Tojo that, I got this great idea. If you help me invade India, what we're going to do is the Indian people are going to rise up a revolt, and they're going to join me, and they're going to say to the British, see you later, and you'll knock India out of the war, which is a huge part of what they want to do. Well, unfortunately, Tojo doesn't really understand English very well, and he doesn't really have any idea what has been said to him. After the conference, some of his staffers, I guess, pull Tojo aside and go, hey, did you hear what that Broz guy was saying? He's like, I don't know. I don't understand it. They said, he's saying that if you help him invade India, that the Indian people are going to rise up and leave the British Empire. And Tojo goes, wow, I like that idea. That's a darn good plan. So he becomes a proponent of this Yugo plan. Well, we're going to implement this plan in a couple of ways. The northern part of the Yugo plan, there's going to be 3 divisions, and they're going to march overland as typical Japanese style. But because he was so upset with the fact that Ord Wingate could supply his troops, he's coming up with a different plan. He is going to march cattle and animals on the hoof, like Genghis Khan did, through the Burmese jungle to feed his troops. And because they can't use trucks or anything, each soldier will carry 1 artillery shell on his back. It's a pretty slim plan for logistics. Well, the 3 division commanders are like, dude, this is not a good plan, okay? We don't have the logistics. You knew this in 42, we didn't have the logistics to do this. Now you're trying to do this. But what's really strange is they go to Tojo. Now the guy comes kind of barging into Tojo's house one night, not Mutoguchi, but somebody he had sent. And Tojo's in the bathtub. And he goes, hey, let's invade India. And Tojo's first thing from the bathtub goes, well, how's the logistics supply? You got the logistics thing done? He goes, oh yeah, no problem. The logistics are going to be great. Well, Tojo's going, he goes, okay, fine. That's what we're going to do then. We'll invade India. Not a particularly good idea. So the Hago attack is set for February 5th, 1944. The IJ is set to begin the invasion of India to bring terms to end the war in Japan's favor, and you can all take a short break. So, here's the deal. I have circled, as I so want to do, where Arakan is. Here is Kohima and Imphal. So the idea of this battle is simply that they're going to have an attack down south, and that will draw the British away from where their main attack is going to be. And they're going to do things, and this is really the most logical place to attack, is actually at Arakan, because it's closer to Rangoon, which is really what the British always want to take, and it's better territory. It's got roads, for example, and it's on the coast. So you can get supplies in, and it's a much more doable area. And what happens is actually in early 43, the British actually launch a big assault in here, and they're defeated. So this area is fought over relatively frequently. Well, the British are planning their own assault, and their forces are kind of strung out. And what the Japanese are going to do is they're going to slip the 55th Division through the jungle, basically. Not quite that jungly there, but they're going to slip them through. And they're going to surround the British, or the Indian 7th Division. And the Indian 7th Division will indeed then do what Indian divisions always have done in the past. They will abandon all their equipment and run away, because their road is cut behind them. And remember, they were always built to fight in Europe. So none of these divisions really, at the time, were designed to fight in these kind of climates or in such a place where there weren't that many roads. So Japan has always used this methodology in the past, and it's always been incredibly successful. Well, the Japanese threatened the south. The British expected the British to move forces away from their main attack in Kohima. So the whole idea of this is, again, this attack is a diversion. It's not the main attack. The Japanese do get in behind the 55th Division, or with the 55th Division. They get behind the 7th Division. They're extremely successfully early on, and they force the Indian Division into what's known as the admin box. This is a very famous battle, so you can look this up on Wikipedia, or there's numerous books about it. Well, the difference is the British have given a lot of thought over the year plus that this has been going on, and they've made the decision that indeed it is a bad idea to just retreat. So what they decide to do instead is to tell the division to stay in place, and we're going to supply you by air. And indeed, that's what they do. And they're going to supply them by air until they can bring in other forces to relieve them. So they bring in 2 extra divisions and a counterattack, and the Japanese, again, they run out of supplies because they have no way to resupply themselves, and this attack fails. And the Indians, as this thing goes on, become actually stronger and stronger and stronger because more and more stuff is brought into them. So this is really going, the British now have, to put it simply, have cracked the code on how to stop the Japanese infiltration tactics. So the way to beat those infiltration tactics is to stay in place, dig in, get supplied by air, and wait for reinforcements to relieve you rather than run away and abandon all your equipment. So at the surrender of Burma in 45, the overall commander, this would be Mutoguchi's boss, states, Allied air supply which permitted ground forces in Burma to consolidate their positions without being forced to retreat, and thus render the Japanese infiltration and encircling tactics abortive. So even the Japanese, by the end of the war, admit that this is what happened in Burma. And the other thing about it is they admit that air superiority cost them the war, at least in Burma, this gentleman, because they couldn't get any supplies in from Japan. They couldn't get the weapons and the food they needed in order to continue to fight. So air power, again, and much different than what we see in the Pacific battles where it's naval air power, This is actually air power used to supply people, cargo planes. All right, so the second piece of the attack was to be at Imphal and Kohima. And please note, there is a road that leads from the south into Imphal. There is a road here that's to go into China. That is the Lido Road. That is the road the U.S. is building so they can get supplies into China instead of having to fly everything in. So the Yugo plan, that's the second piece. Again, they're going to use infiltration tactics for the two northern divisions, but the southern division, which is known as the Yamamoto Force, it's named after another guy named Yamamoto, not the Admiral Yamamoto, but a Japanese general named Yamamoto. Apparently it's not that uncommon a name in Japan. And he is leading the main force, which has 95 tanks and some heavy artillery. And again, they have a road, so they can get more supplies to these people. Well, the original attack, particularly coming in, is the second group is to infiltrate overland and attack Imphal from the north. So that would be this arrow. And then there should actually be a third arrow on this map, which there is not. I should probably put one on. And that is what they're going to do with this group. And that group is going to capture Kohima. And Kohima is incredibly important because it is a mountain pass and it's a direct line to Burma, from Burma into India. So it's very important. But again, none of these groups have any logistics except the southern group, the Yamamoto Force. And the Japanese command still hasn't grasped what has occurred down in Arakan. They haven't really put their hands around the fact that because of air power, cargo plane air power, the British have a huge, huge advantage. Well, the other piece of this battle is the Indian National Army. That's the group that Subhas Chandra Bose has created. And they were originally going to be just used as scouts. And Bose says, no, I want these guys to fight as a unit, kind of like General Pershing in World War I did with the U.S. troops. And they are going to fight against British rule, and hopefully the British command basically the troops under British command will desert. That's the idea. And he's going to use this as one big force, not just for propaganda and reconnaissance. So there's a couple of groups in here. The 1st Division, initially the Subhas Brigade, named after him, and the 1st Guerrilla Regiment, less a battalion. Those guys were sent to Arakan to help try to get people to defect there. And they covered the 33rd Division. That's the division that's further, that's the Central Division. The 2nd Guerrilla Regiment was attached to the Yamamoto Force. That's the southern group. And perhaps the most important is the Special Services Group. And they are going to act as scouts, and they're particularly tasked to infiltrate the British and, of course, encourage those British units to defect. And these guys are primarily by Kohima. Well, the British are also planning an attack at this time in this area. And they've kind of forestalled that plan because of the fact of what was going on in Arakan. Remember, they did move 2 divisions down to Arakan. So they know that the Japanese are going to attack, but they think they've got 2 weeks' time. And so they think they've got plenty of time to get their ducks in a row before the Japanese launch this assault. Unfortunately, their intelligence is wrong. And the Japanese attacked 2 weeks earlier. So the southern force, the Yamamoto, the guys that have the tanks and the artillery that are moving up the road, they actually do a pretty good job. They start to make huge advances. And they get stalled by British armor and infantry right before Imphal's airfield. So the airfield doesn't fall. And that's very critical. So they're, again, these units, these Japanese units, the further they attack, the weaker and weaker they become. And, of course, what's going to happen is the British are going to get stronger and stronger. So it's a similar situation to Admin Box. Imphal is in effect surrounded. The Japanese have cut the road, and they've coming in from the south, so that road is blocked. But these are going to come to the rescue. This is a C-46 Commando. It wasn't a particularly successful aircraft, but it carried significantly more weight than the C-47, the more famous Douglas DC-3. And what they are going to do is the British 5th Indian Division is available because of the Arakan battle ending so soon and the fact that the 7th Indian Division was not destroyed. So the British have a division down south that they can use. And they get the U.S. involved because the U.S. is using all these aircraft to fly supplies to China. And they say, you know what, we really need these planes right now, probably more than the Chinese need supplies. So the British beg us literally to give them more aircraft. And we do. We give them numerous C-47s and 30 actually of these C-46s. So now they've got a significant amount of supply capability they didn't have before, even though they have a good amount. But now we've given them a lot more. And they managed to move that entire 5th Division by air into Imphal in 10 days, including their artillery. They literally disassemble their artillery pieces and load them up on planes and fly them in. And fly in the shells and everything they need. So this is a tremendous ability that we've seen now that we have developed in order to move things via air. And of course, we have total air superiority. The Japanese Army aircraft, as we talked about, are not particularly effective. And we begin to interdict the Japanese supplies. So again, Japanese plans are thwarted by air power at Imphal. Well, the Kohima part of the plan is kind of similar. But what happens there is that they are going to get this pass. If they can take Kohima, they will, A, cut off Imphal completely. They will get to the Lido Road, and they will also have an open road into India. And they launch a whole division, and the British find this out because they think it's like a regiment coming. And all of a sudden, they run into this Indian parachute brigade, and they beat the Indian parachute brigade, but documents are captured, and now the British know that there's a whole division coming towards Kohima and this place called Dimapur, and Dimapur is a huge, gigantic supply base. And so what they originally do is they put most of their forces to protect Dimapur, because the last thing they can afford is to lose this supply base. Well, a whole division of Japanese troops, again, unfortunately, they don't have a lot of heavy weapons. Remember, each guy's carrying an artillery shell on his back. That's all the artillery shells they have. There's only 2,500 troops in Kohima, British and Indian, and 1,000 of those are non-combat force. And in amazingly intense hand-to-hand combat, literally on one side of a tennis court to the other, they have this battle. And so if you know how big a tennis court is, you can literally throw a grenade from one side to the other. This goes on for days, and it's some of the bitterest fighting in World War II. Well, the Japanese do eventually take this area, the tennis court and the surrounding buildings, but they don't have enough combat power left after this fight to take a key position called Garrison Hill. And indeed, now they have to go on the defensive. The 3 Japanese division commanders that thought Mutaguchi was all wet thinking about this plan basically say, we need to end the offensive. But Mutaguchi relieves them of command one at a time. So basically fires these guys. They continue fighting for 4 months without supplies, with the British getting stronger and stronger every day. And the Japanese have no choice but to retreat, and like the British, they are now so weak. Unfortunately, they don't abandon their equipment. They literally are so weak and sick and dying of disease that they can't carry anything. So they abandon everything and just basically escape as best they can. So the casualties for the Japanese are 57,000 killed or wounded. Most of these die of disease or starvation. And the INA, the Indian National Army loses 50% of its strength. And the British lose 12,000 men as well. But what the British have done is they've broken the Japanese army in Burma. So it's a huge, huge defeat for the British, or excuse me, for the Japanese by the British. Now, if I'd like you to look at this map closely, because we're going to talk about the second major and the largest offensive of the war by the Japanese. And so if you look at this map, you can see this area, the dark area, is what the Japanese have conquered of China by 1941. And this stays relatively static through the bulk of the war. So because the Japanese have a lot of other things going on. So they can't really do too much in this area. They basically use this as relatively, there's still fighting going on, but it's relatively quiet and not a lot of movement. So what the Japanese do is they come up with a plan called Ichigo, and that's from April to December of 1944. Again, the Japanese military situation is deteriorating rapidly. German victory in Europe is becoming increasingly remote, but the emperor is demanding one victory so he can indeed make peace on some sort of acceptable terms. And as we talked about last week, it's the Imperial Japanese Navy's job to defeat the U.S. fleet in 1944, but it's the Imperial Japanese Army's responsibility to create a victory also in 1944, but they decide where they are going to create the victory is they are going to create that victory on the Asian mainland. So the Navy is supposed to stop our fleet, and the Japanese Army is going to try to knock China out of the war. So they bring in Field Marshal Hata. He's really quite good. And he devises a plan for the largest Japanese offensive of World War II. 3 major goals. The first is to create a rail route all the way from Vietnam to Korea. So that whole section of China that they never captured, they're going to capture that whole big section and create a rail route because our submarines are sinking so many of their ships. Also, they know the B-29 is coming in, so they want to capture air bases to push the B-29 further away from Japan. And third, and of course most important, is they're going to make an effort to knock China out of the war completely. So what he does is he strips the Kwantung Army, that is the army up in Manchuria or Manchukuo, that is defending against perhaps the Soviets. He also takes numerous forces that were being used against the Chinese communists. And he gathers, so now basically they're saying Mao's group isn't that big a threat. We need those troops for this assault. So that is where they get a huge, huge force of troops. And how much do they get? They get 17 divisions, 500,000 men, 15,000 vehicles, 6,000 artillery pieces, and 800 tanks, and 100,000 horses. So this is not some little dinky offensive. Remember, the Japanese, the best they can do on these islands that we attacking are maybe 60, 70,000 troops. They're going to launch an assault here with 500,000. Well, there's multiple Chinese armies that are facing this thing, but they don't have a lot of tanks. They don't have a lot of motorized transport. They're incredibly poorly led. And the Chinese army is riddled with corruption. They actually, if you think about a press gang or a Shanghai, I guess would be a term, that's what they do to get troops. They literally go into a village and grab young men and march them off basically in chains to be in the Chinese army. And there's huge, huge amounts of waste and corruption in these armies. Well, here's the Japanese plan. What they're going to do is they're going to start with an offensive going this way, heading south. They're then going to launch a third offensive from the center, going further south, and then the third part will be coming in from Hong Kong and from French Indochina to make a rail route all the way to Korea. They're also going to take all these air bases. These are all Chinese air bases. And once they capture those air bases, that will have two effects. This is where the B-29s are going to be located, but now the B-29s are going to be in range of Japanese aircraft, so that puts them at risk. And also these air bases we're able to use to interdict sea traffic on the way to Japan. So this has got a lot of events for the Japanese. But remember, the main idea here is to defeat Chiang Kai-shek. So Chiang's aware of this buildup, and he begins to take troops that he's been using to protect him from Mao Zedong. Okay, so basically he's got a lot of good troops that are trying to keep Mao and the communists up in the north where he wants them out of the way. The Japanese launch the attack on April, and they crush these armies of Chiang Kai-shek. It's a disaster, because he thought these were the best troops he had, these guys that were basically stationed to fight against Mao. And unfortunately for them, they proved to be just a total disaster for the Chinese. Japanese continue the battle. They go in the June, the middle group goes out, and they capture major sections of Shangasa, which had been defended 3 times before successfully. 47-day major battle. Again, the Japanese crush the Chinese. But the Japanese miss an opportunity. Because those armies were crushed in the center, which is the closest to Chongqing, had they changed their plan, they could have moved, instead of moving further south, they could have moved west. Had they moved west, there's a good possibility, because there was nothing to stop them, that they would have captured Chongqing. Had they captured Chongqing, of course, that was the capital of Chiang Kai-shek, and it's a very good possibility he would have knocked the Chinese nationalists out of the war. The Japanese, as usual, always stick to a plan. They never really come up with other thought processes, and they miss that opportunity. The Japanese have begun a reprisal campaign, and they begin to kill Chinese civilians, perhaps as many as 200,000. And what really comes about this is the Chinese people begin to see that the nationalist Chiang Kai-shek's government can't protect them from the Japanese, and it causes much problems for Chiang Kai-shek. And so finally, November 1st is the last attack, and they indeed succeed, creating a landline all the way to French Indochina and direct rail route to the southern resource area. The Chinese opposing forces in the final phase mostly have retreated. These are guys that are badly demoralized. They're not particularly effective. And by December, they are completely defeated. And Ichigo has indeed achieved 2 of its 3 goals. The number 1 goal that they achieved is they've got the rail line. The number 2 goal is they've put our B-29s at risk, and they've also moved the air bases away from the coast, so they can't use that. But they have not knocked the Chinese government out of the war. Well, so let's look at how this worked out. Here's that first picture I showed you. That's where the Chongqing and the air bases are. This is what happens after the battle. They have indeed taken all this area of China and have now created, indeed, probably their most successful offensive of the actual war. So it was actually relatively successful in regards to what their original goals were. Unfortunately, those goals were a little mistaken, because what happens is they haven't defeated Chiang Kai-shek completely, and what they've done is they've made their area that they now have to control so much bigger. So they now have more and more resources that they could have used elsewhere being used here. So that's a problem. They've got much more area to defend, and again, they don't have any more troops with which to defend it. But it's a major political defeat for Chiang Kai-shek. His forces did so poorly that the U.S., the head of the U.S. Military there is a gentleman called General Vinegar Joe Stilwell. He has never liked Chiang Kai-shek. He always thinks the Chinese are incompetent, and he wants to be in command of all Chinese armies. And he gets Roosevelt to request this. Now, the ambassador there is telling Roosevelt, this isn't a good idea, because the Chinese aren't going to accept this. In effect, you're doing what the Japanese have done, is you're basically overthrowing the Chinese government by putting a U.S. commander in charge of all Chinese forces. So Chiang refuses and says, I'll take anybody you want to give me except Stilwell. Well, they replace Stilwell. And then Hurley meets with the Chinese communists. And he just thinks, you know what, the Chinese communists are actually a better ally than Chiang Kai-shek. And he gives in to all the communist demands. So they are going to now share control of the government, and they are going to share control of the Chinese military. All in one case. Boom. So, Ichigo operation is a huge victory for Mao and the Chinese communists. Because of the fact that the Japanese removed forces away from the Chinese communists, that's left Mao more opportunities to grow. The fact that the nationalists have removed their forces blocking Mao Zedong, they have begun to give him more area to control. This is a huge, huge win for Mao. And the nationalists try to maintain these large Western-style armies. Well, unfortunately, large Western-style armies need a lot of logistics. They also need a lot of people, and they need a lot of people that are under full control rather than a guerrilla army. In a guerrilla army, let's face it, you can go fight at night and then go back home and pretend to be a civilian. Well, in a nationalist army, you can't do that. So again, I was telling you, they were press-ganging people. It's also a time of famine in China. So this big nationalist army is actually taking food from the Chinese people that they need. And so consequently, the nationalist army becomes seen as an enemy of the Chinese people. It's not exactly what you want to do if you want to be in control of a government. So the failure of the nationalists to stop the Japanese also creates a huge issue in the U.S. press. The U.S. press begins to see Mao Zedong as much more favorable light than they see the nationalist government. And after the war, because of all this bad press and all this corruption and all these things that are going wrong with the nationalist army, finally Truman says, we're going to withdraw aid completely from Chiang during the Chinese Civil War. And that brings us to the end of the war in China, which is interesting, I think. And this was actually, Dwight had asked this question. So Dwight, we're going to hopefully answer this for you today. And Dwight had asked, what happened to all the Japanese that were left in China when the war ended? Well, we created a thing called Operation Beleaguer. And what we did was we landed the Marine Amphibious Corps that was going to invade Kyushu, the Japanese home island, and we landed it on the Chinese mainland. And the plan there was, remember, we were going to take everything away from the Japanese. They would have no presence whatsoever on the Asian mainland. Well, consequently, the idea of Beleaguer was that the Japanese would surrender to us, not to the nationalists or the communists, and then we would transport them back to Japan. And the reason we wanted to transport them back to Japan is we could control them there, because Japan was occupied by U.S. troops. So the interesting thing is, does anybody have any idea when the U.S. actually left China? Does anybody know? What year? 1949. So we stayed there for 4 years on the Chinese mainland with U.S. Marines and combat power. So needless to say, the Chinese communists never thought too much of us for the fact that we actually occupied a significant part of China for 4 years after the war. And Mao says, without the Japanese invasion, my forces would still be in the wilderness. So indeed, Japan invading China sets up the situation where Mao can win the war. And one of the other reasons I didn't mention is the Japanese leave all their weapons behind when we take them back to Japan. Well, guess who takes all their weapons? Mao Zedong. So basically, he's using Japanese equipment to beat the Nationalist Army. So the Nationalist Army had a lot of problems, of course. The Chinese people don't like them particularly because of all the corruption and stealing food and yada yada. And in fact, Mao is now armed with Japanese equipment. So the question stands now. When does World War II end? And I told you in the first class that this class was going to take a more international view of World War II in the Pacific. So many historians believe that World War II actually didn't start in 1939 in September in Poland. It started in 1937 at the Marco Bridge incident. So that's the first piece. So many people, particularly Asian and a lot of British, feel that actually the war started here, not with Germany. So perhaps the most important effect was the end of Western imperialism. Let's think about that. If we look at Europe at the end of World War II, Britain is still a country, Germany is divided, but it's still a country, Russia is still there. Nothing has really changed significantly. The governments have changed in some of these countries, but they still exist. There's nothing majorly changed there. Germans are still Germans. But what changes in Asia is these people were dominated for centuries by the West. So all these imperialist governments have now become fragile because of the war, and also the Asians themselves, because of seeing what the Japanese were capable of doing, begin to think that in a pan-Asian manner, that indeed they can become separate, independent, nationalist countries. So, the fighting doesn't end in Asia, if we think about it. The Chinese Civil War lasts until 1949. Again, it's Chinese against Chinese, but there's significant. Again, Chiang Kai-shek is seen as a tool of the imperialist West. The Dutch in Indonesia are not thrown out by Sukarno until 1949. India is granted independence from Britain in 1947. Burma gets it in 1948. And the Vietnamese continue to fight the French until 1954. So consequently, oh, by the way, the Korean War is not over. I'm sure everybody knows that. It's still never been actually finished. So when does the war actually end? Well, the argument can easily be made that the biggest and most significant thing that comes out of World War II is the fact that Asia is no longer dominated by imperialist powers. Again, everything else pretty much stays the same after World War I. I mean, certainly there were nationalist aspirations in perhaps countries like Czechoslovakia when the Austro-Hungarian Empire breaks up. But the biggest change, really for hundreds of years in world history, is the fact that Asia now can become independent. And I think that's probably the most significant thing to come out of World War II, is the emergence of Asia. So let's look at the world's largest economies in 2017. Number one is the US, since 1871. Number two in the world, China. Number three in the world, Japan. Number 6, India. Number 11, South Korea. And number 16, Indonesia. Think where these economies would be if they were still being, for example, where would the British economy be on this list if indeed they still had China, or lots of parts of China, and they still had India? How large would the British economy be? Would they be largest in the world? They'd certainly be very large, certainly larger than they are. Look at the Netherlands. We don't think of the Netherlands as being much of a powerhouse, but if you added 18 and 16 together, they'd be pretty potent. How large would Japan be if they still had Korea? So I really believe that this is, you can see on this chart how significant the change was after World War II in that area. And with that, I will take any questions that you'd like to ask. Yes?
The Chinese puppet government in India, did they have an army that fought with the Japanese?
Manchukuo, they had basically a...
No, the other guy.
Yeah, he had like a police force. The question is the Japanese puppet government in the main part of China, did they have an army? And I wouldn't really call it as much an army as they did have like a military police, I guess would be the best way about it. They were there to control the population and to keep order, basically. So it would be like your local town police, kind of more maybe like the National Guard. Any other questions? You guys are quiet today. Well, yes. Yep. California has a larger economy than Russia. Yes, ma'am. Well, I wouldn't say that my answer is going to be correct. And this would be one of those things, if I had more time next week, I'd tell you exactly. But my opinion for what makes up Asia would be India, Manchuria, Mongolia, China, Japan, Korea, Indonesia, Burma, which would be now Myanmar, that whole Vietnam, obviously, yeah, North Vietnam, South Vietnam at the time, Laos, Cambodia, that whole area. Is that sort of good? Yes? Yeah, why not? Throw them in there. They're kind of more Spanish because of all the time that Spain held them, but sure, I think that would count, sure. I think it's Myanmar. It's one of those things I always read. I never hear it said. Yes?
As regards the interdiction of Japanese supply lines in this area that you talked about, is that movie, The Bridge on the River Kwai, pure fiction, or?
No, they indeed built the Death Railway. The question is the movie Bridge on the River Kwai complete fiction? And many aspects of it are complete fiction. For example, the bridge on the River Kwai does not exist. No British prisoners willingly built the bridge to show the Japanese that they were better than them. Okay, so that whole premise is ludicrous, really. But indeed, there was a thing called the Death Railroad. And the Death Railroad was to get a rail line up into northern Burma. None existed. And so indeed, various bridges were built on the rivers to get there. And that was all built by either British prisoners of war, Indian prisoners of war, conscripted troops from Malaysia, Indonesians were brought in, and the local population was brought in. And these people, many of them died of starvation, particularly typhus was a problem. And it's a very, very famous Japanese war atrocity. But not just for military personnel, for indigenous people as well. Yes?
Say a little bit about your next course.
Oh, sure, why not? Why not do a little selling while I'm here? When is my next course anyway? Where is it? Do you know? I don't know. We'll figure it out. All right, here's the deal. I had made a course almost 3 years ago now called The Atomic Bomb and the End of World War II. So I had briefly mentioned this last time. This course has a significant amount of military history, but it has a lot more Japanese and political history as well. And the idea of this course is that it will start you with the first emperor of Japan, and we will take you up until 1945. And I think it's important to understand the position of the emperor if you're going to understand why the Japanese, for example, had kamikazes and why they didn't surrender much sooner. So that's the idea of the class. And then, of course, we will talk about the use of the bomb, and we will talk about the planned invasion of Japan by the U.S., and we will talk about things I didn't get into here, like the submarine offensive, the B-29 bombing of Japan, and many more military topics that I just couldn't jam into this thing. If I would have had you know, maybe 3-4 more weeks in this semester, I could have got everything I wanted to do with this class. And then I made the decision, well, after this class, I might as well just repeat the other one and then just try to modify it. Now, if you took the class before, those of you that may have taken it before, week 2 is completely different. So if you don't want to go through the whole class, come to week 2. Week 3 will be significantly different. Week 3 basically was I did this class in 1 week. So you can see it was pretty abbreviated. So that's what that class will be about, and we will come to the conclusion of the use of the bomb and its effect on Asia, not just its effect on the US and Japan. You see that? I always go there. So it's always kind of my deal. I like to look at the picture being larger. So hopefully some of you will come, whenever it is. It'll be in winter. Anything else? Yes?
When did World War II end?
In my opinion, 1954. But most people's opinion, September of 45. Yes?
Frank, that's a little arbitrary. 54, okay, the French left, but we took over for them.
Well, I don't want to go down that road. Yeah? I'm just telling you. Now, I'm going to just, all right, in that regard, okay, to answer your question, I'm going to send all of you an email, hopefully today, and it is an incredibly long lecture that came out of actually Malaysia. And the gentleman is from Cambridge University that's giving this lecture, and he will tell you why it was 54 without going down to the United States. Also, when you see this thing, all right, I don't want to freak anybody out here, but the fact of the matter is, the lecture starts out with the first 20 minutes are from this professor from China, and he's really hard to understand, okay? I mean, really hard to understand. So if you want to, like, do yourself a favor, skip into the YouTube thing about 20, 25 minutes and get the guy from Cambridge. The guy from China is interesting, but I was pulling my hair out trying to figure out what the hell he was talking about. So again, I'll send it today, skip about 25 minutes, because I guarantee you, you probably aren't going to have the patience to listen to the first guy, okay? So thank you all for coming. I appreciate it, and we'll see you hopefully next semester.